Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Saturday, August 30th, and this will be the Week 3 announcement for Political Science 3753 Constitutional Law for the fall 2025 term. Okay, everybody. On the syllabus for this week, we have some material that we sort of previewed for the quiz you took last week. Okay, we sort of previewed it last week. We have the notes for Lecture 4 on efforts to curb or limit the Supreme Court. And then in Lecture 5, threshold requirements or requirements that must be met before a case can be brought. Okay, now, ex parte McCardle is in the outline. It's discussed in the notes for Lecture 4, and we had you look at that for the quiz last week. And then we sent you some material pertaining to Baker versus Carr, which raises the issue of the political question doctrine, and that issue is discussed extensively in the opinion that was issued for Baker versus Carr. Everybody, all we have on the syllabus for this week is the class notes for lectures 4 and 5. We have on the syllabus tentatively a quiz for the following week on or about September 11th, and then a discussion which will run for 48 hours on or about September 17th. It's a little early to get those assignments out. I would look for something in your inbox and on the course website in the announcements area about a quiz. Look for the assignment for the quiz later this week. And the quiz will take place on or about the 11th, the discussion on or about the 17th. Let me say, everybody, everyone as a whole did well on the quiz. I don't believe there were any scores worse than 16 out of 20 or 8 correct items out of 10. So that was very good. Now, efforts to curb or limit the Supreme Court in your and my lifetimes, and mine stretches a little bit before most of yours, I imagine, from the 50s to the present day, this really began with efforts to strike back or push back at the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Warren Court, so-called. Then after he left the court, he was succeeded by Warren Burger. And under the Burger Court, of course, we got the Roe versus Wade decision that culminated in further efforts to push back at the Supreme Court, culminating finally in the Dobbs decision almost 50 years later, which we will be discussing before let me see. We will get to that, to Dobbs and Roe versus Wade, immediately after midterm. Okay. There are several ways by which we can push back at the Supreme Court. Your class notes mention there have been several constitutional amendments that have been aimed in whole or in part at particular Supreme Court decisions. We could say that the 14th Amendment was directed at overturning the Dred Scott decision. Okay. The 16th Amendment was added to overturn a decision in which the Supreme Court held an income tax was unconstitutional. So we got an amendment specifically authorizing Congress to impose an income tax, thus reversing that decision in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust from 1895, I believe. Okay, and there have been several instances like that are discussed in the class notes. If the decision involves a statute and not the Constitution, then the decision can be addressed by changing the statute. We mentioned in the class notes in the area of employment discrimination and affirmative action, a couple examples of that would include the Grove City case and the Ward's Cove case. In the case of Ward's Cove, that was addressed, I believe, by the legislation known as the Civil Rights Act of 1991, going back to the administration of the first President Bush. Okay. Now, of course, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, we had the very famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, attempt to pack the Supreme Court. Roosevelt proposed one additional justice for every justice on the court over the age of 70, I believe it was, which would have meant 6 additional justices. And presumably, these would be justices Roosevelt would appoint, who would presumably agree with his views. That meant that cases that the Roosevelt administration had lost by 6-3, they might now win by 9-6. And these largely involved cases in which the Supreme Court pushed back at or tried to declare as unconstitutional various New Deal programs. Okay. Well, the court packing plan was not successful, but the Supreme Court eventually changed its tune, okay, and began to uphold some of the programs of the sort that it had struck down just a couple of years earlier. Was that or was that not in response to political pressure or to the court packing plan itself? Well, that is a controversy that perhaps can never be settled. Okay. The ex parte McCardle case involved Congress's attempt to withdraw certain matters from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and the language of Article 3 can be read as permitting that. Okay. Language that gives the court jurisdiction, and it says, with such exceptions as Congress may impose, or words to that effect. That language is in Article 3. And the Congress attempted to do that in the Reconstruction era. Now, the authors of your textbook regard this as highly problematical, and we address that it's in the textbook, okay, in the discussion, in just those couple of pages where it discusses ex parte McCardle. Something that really hasn't been attempted seriously in the meantime. And the authors of your textbook believe we could seriously compromise the Constitution if we were to resort to that too often. It might culminate in Congress preventing people from trying to validate their rights in the court system. But nevertheless, that language is in the Constitution. And the Supreme Court felt obligated to acknowledge it in the case of ex parte McCardle, that you were reading and answered some questions on for the quiz. Compliance has not always been immediately forthcoming. Brown versus Board of Education would be one example of that. There was a case known as Brown versus Board 2. Okay, the first Brown decision came in 1954, and the second in the following year, I believe, in which various school boards asked for further instruction from the Supreme Court about implementing the Brown versus Board decision to desegregate the schools. And the court said in the second Brown decision that schools were to desegregate, but they could do so with all deliberate speed. All deliberate speed. In other words, they had to go ahead and desegregate, but they could do so deliberately or slowly, carefully, and gradually. Okay. There was resistance. We know in Little Rock, President Eisenhower had to send military forces in to supervise the integration of schools such as Little Rock Central High School. So compliance is not always immediately forthcoming. In the school prayer case, Engel versus Vitale, okay, schools attempted all kinds of things. Instead of explicitly writing a prayer to be said at the beginning of the school day, schools responded by trying to offer a moment of silence at the beginning of the school day, and the court did not completely buy that. So there can be push and pull between the court and those upon whom the court is imposing its orders or its rulings. Okay. Immediate compliance is not always forthcoming. The court has to take that into account. It perhaps will hesitate to make a ruling that it knows will not be accepted or that it might not be able to enforce. That was an issue all the way back to Marbury versus Madison, as we know. Okay. So compliance can be an issue. Everybody, it's worth noting, in putting these notes together, I have drawn upon the work of constitutional scholar Lewis Fisher. And Lewis Fisher says, we cannot regard the Supreme Court as infallible. That would be asking far too much of the Supreme Court. its rulings are final until or unless the court reverses itself. Okay, its rulings are binding, but it's not infallible. Okay. What Lewis Fisher says is that when an important ruling comes down, this often initiates a kind of pushback. The president can be involved, the Congress, other levels of the court system, the public, the press, professors in the law schools, in the academic journals. Okay? All kinds of commentary may follow. The voters themselves. Apparently what's happened recently with the Trump elections, the way we can interpret that is voters were engaging in constitutional interpretation in their own right. A significant minority of voters wanted an interpretation of the First Amendment that was more accommodationist rather than separationist on church and state. And Trump has appointed justices, along with some justices who were already there, who are ready to do that, to be more accommodationist and less separationist. And we will see that after midterm when we look at some of the recent religion cases. Okay. So the Supreme Court's not the only one who gets to engage in constitutional interpretation. Lots and lots of people, including the voting public, get a say and get to let their voices be heard. Okay. If the president wants to veto a bill because the president thinks the bill is unconstitutional, the president is within his or her rights to do so, and that's not reviewable. Once the president vetoes a bill, it's vetoed until the veto is overridden. And so the president can make his or her own judgment about whether something is constitutional or not. It's not only the Supreme Court that gets involved in constitutional interpretation, an important point to make. Now then, everybody, that was Lecture 4, the notes for Lecture 4 on efforts to curb the court. In Lecture 5, we talk about threshold requirements, or requirements that must be met before a case can be brought. Among these, there must be a legitimate case or controversy. There can't be a test case or a contrived case where the parties bringing a case are not really in disagreement. The court will be wary of that and may decline to take a case in which it thinks that that is what's going on. The party bringing the case must have standing. And you look at a series of cases, Frothingham v. Mellon from the 1920s, Flast v. Cohen, 1968, Valley Forge College, 1982. Does a taxpayer have standing? Okay. If a taxpayer is paying a small portion of his or her taxes to fund a program that that taxpayer thinks is unconstitutional, does that confer standing on that taxpayer so that that taxpayer can bring suit and bring it before the Supreme Court? The court has equivocated on that and gone back and forth. Okay. At first, it denied taxpayer standing in the 1920s, then it granted it in the 1960s. Okay. Mootness and rightness are related concepts. Mootness. Now, one of the first affirmative action cases was Diffunis from 1974. That's in your class notes. And what the court ruled was that by the time the case got to the court, Diffunis already had been admitted to law school, and so that rendered the case moot. Okay? So mootness means something has happened to resolve or remove the issue that prompted bringing the case in the first place. Okay, now the mirror image of that is rightness. Okay? We could have a situation where there's a potential violation of rights, but the court judges that the violation has not yet occurred, so the case is not ripe. So a case may not yet be ripe, or it may have become moot. Okay? Then everybody, we have the big political football of the political question doctrine, which is discussed thoroughly in Baker versus Carr, which I believe is Justice Brennan who lays down criteria for when the political question doctrine can be invoked, or when the doctrine holds. The doctrine basically involves the court saying, this is not a fit matter for the courts to adjudicate. It's for the political branches, Congress, the president, the state governors and legislatures perhaps to address. It's not a proper question to be brought before the courts. Okay. And Justice Brennan, in the Baker versus Carr decision, lays out several criteria for when the political question doctrine might apply. Observers of the court often say that the point of the doctrine is to allow the Supreme Court to duck a case that it thinks may be too much of a hot potato. In other words, something that issue the court really may not be able to resolve simply by issuing a ruling. Dred Scott could be a good example of that, where it might have been wise to invoke the political question doctrine. But it's something the court will invoke from time to time, and you'll see in your class notes a number of instances where the court has declined to adjudicate an issue because they feel that it really is a political question to be left to the elected officials to deal with. Okay, everybody, that will be it for this week. There will be a quiz next week, and more than likely a discussion the following week. Watch your inbox, watch your announcements page on the course website for the assignments for the quiz and the discussion that will be coming up over the next couple of weeks. I believe we want to try to get 3 quizzes and 3 discussions in before the midterm, which will be coming up, let's see, well, this is a 16-week schedule, so just after the 1st of October, we will have the midterm exam. So we have a quiz coming up around the 11th, a discussion around the 17th, and then we'll try to get in at least one more quiz and one more discussion before the midterm, which I believe is coming up right after the 1st of October. So take a look at that material in the lecture notes for lectures 4 and 5. And after that, we'll have more material and a quiz and a discussion, and we'll be getting out the assignments for those in the coming days. In the meantime, look through that material, and we'll talk to you once again about a week from now at this time. Take it easy.